Welcome back to a new edition of the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. What is progress? In this segment, I want to talk about a defining concept. A defining concept not just for the Shinsei method, for purposes of the Shinsei method and for the definition and meaning of the Shinsei method. Recall, the Shinsei method I developed as a method of self-training, self-development. It's loosely translated from the Japanese to mean principle, being, mind, or shin, which is principle, being, mind, sei, which means life, life principle. And I chose life principle for a very specific reason, because what I found is that in many social settings, there are a lot of messages that are communicated to you. A lot of these messages are platitudes, or they amount to being platitudes, although there's a lot of wisdom in them. A lot of times in many social settings, people don't go behind the platitudes and go into the meaning of these platitudes so that you can really get at the value of these platitudes and the value of these sayings, like leading by example. That's a common one. Now, there's another common one that is very prominent in many business settings that applies to this segment of the show: change management. Now, when people talk about change management, you would think that they're talking about progress. And there's a subtle implication that that's what that implies. And when we talk about progress, most of the time people understand progress really in terms of a mathematical function. As you know from looking at previous segments of the show, which you can find at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel as well as the shinseimethod.com. I like to use mathematics and mathematical functions because there's a lot of insight. We also use concepts from investing in science, although I don't offer investment advice. I'm not an investment counselor. But I like to go into, from the perspective of a private investor, the concepts and the principles of investing and those kind of practices, because again, there's a lot of wisdom in it. And investing is not immune to this use of platitudes. You'll see this a lot. Like the idea that the stock market is like a gambling casino. Now, to some extent, yes, there is some element of risk when you invest in a stock. But it's not a gambling casino, particularly not if you approach investment from the perspective of a rational investor, where you are looking to gain value from a company in terms of what that company does, the products and services it offers, how it's managed, and you're looking to invest in what the company does and in that company and in the people of that company. To me, that is what is behind the value of investing and the concept of investing. Now, if you think about it from that perspective, there's a lot of wisdom that's behind it. It's not a gambling casino. What you're really doing is you're investing time, money, energy, and effort of your own to, let's say, research a company, but you're also investing in the time, energy, effort, and intelligence and management skills of the people that make that company up, as well as the product and or services that company sells, because ultimately the company is selling a product or service to someone, to customers. So there's some value to what that company is offering, and when you're investing in that value. That's how I understand investing. Well, there's a lot of wisdom that's behind just that simple, really, analysis and that simple definition of investing. The wisdom that's behind it is you're striving toward value. You're using your time and energy and effort of your life in order to capitalize on value, because value is so crucial. Now, that's very important. It's important from the perspective of the Shinsei method, but it's also important from the perspective of progress, because another important concept when I think about progress and mathematical functions is when you add something to when you add a concept, or you add a constant or even a variable to, let's say, a mathematical function, a linear or an algebraic mathematical function, ax plus bx plus cx, simple mathematical formula. When you add something to that, let's say +1, you could consider that +1 an example of progress. You're augmenting what that mathematical function is. And most of the time, when people understand progress, they understand it in those very simplistic terms. In other words, most people understand progress to mean that when you have a baseline, you are what you are who you are at the moment. Progress would mean that +1, that next day, that development, that improvement. Now, I use improvement loosely, and I want to put it in quotation marks, air quotes as some people often call it, because typically I don't like to use the idea of improvement, because usually implied in this idea of improvement is for some reason you don't like where you are. To some degree, that's true. I mean, if you're thinking about progress and improvement and achievement, if you're satisfied with where you are, then there's really very little motivation to change anything. But also what's implied in that is that there's something bad in where you are or what your current status is. And I don't like that. I don't think that's very helpful. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use the word improvement. It is quick. It's easy to understand that you want to augment where you are currently, that +1 in the algebraic equation. But I also like to use the word development, and it's slightly different because it doesn't have that same connotation that where you are is not what you like. It just means you're developing. You are augmenting, or you are increasing, or you are going forward in a sense, or you are progressing. Now, this is important because when I talk about the Shinsei method, that's really one of the first steps of the Shinsei method, to define your key terms, where you analyze your key terms, as we just did. We analyze what we mean by progress, development, improvement, etc. Define those key terms in an individually suitable way. What's appropriate and individualized to you? One of the great things about America insofar as, or in comparison to a lot of other countries, is that there's an emphasis here on individuality and to individualize and customize things. And I like that concept, this customization of experience. It's very important, I feel, because what it allows you to do is apply these concepts that you're using on an individual way or on a daily basis. And you're allowing you to apply these concepts in a way that's individually suitable to you. And that's one thing that you don't get a lot of encouragement in many social settings, particularly throughout school, to do that, to individualize your educational experience, to individualize your learning experience, so that you can learn it in a way that's going to be of a practical benefit and profit to you. And that's one of the reasons, again, that I developed the Shinsei method to approach learning, development, growth, progress, in a sense. These concepts, how you use them, how you communicate with them, how you communicate with others, and then ultimately the value in your life, the value in your results, the quality of the value of your results. It affects a lot of things that you do. And you will affect changes in all of those things. If, first of all, you understand what you're doing. Secondly, you understand those concepts that you're using. And thirdly, you understand how you're applying them in day-to-day life, how you're using them in a way that's going to be of benefit to you. And I like the practicality aspect of it because ultimately that's what value comes down to. It comes down to what's of practical use and benefit to you. And that's what I mean when I understand, or when I use the word profitability. When I talk about 3 pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability in this case is what's of benefit to you. It's not just profit in terms of financial profit. That's included, but that's a very small aspect of what I mean when I talk about profit and profitability. So it's important to understand the concepts that you use and to think about those concepts and how you apply them so that they can make sense to you. And that's really one of the messages that is behind, and one of the goals that's behind the Shinsei method. So when I talk about progress and I talk about what is progress to you, that's the process that I encourage you to follow when you're thinking about what's progress. Because a lot of times what you have in many social settings is, number one, not a lot of social support for progress. Even though people talk about it a lot, you don't see a lot of really practical results from that. In many social settings, you don't see a lot of progress. People don't seem to understand things any better. They don't seem to communicate any better. They don't seem to be better equipped to handle difficulties, crises, challenges, problems. when they're confronted with a problem, they don't seem to really take corrective action based upon the results and what has happened, so that they can then go through that process of development, or if you like, or if you prefer, improvement. They don't go through that process of taking corrective action. Now, why do I talk about that? I talk about that because part and parcel of progress is this concept of taking corrective action. But in many social settings, I don't see a lot of support for taking corrective action. What I see is people just accepting the status quo, people just accepting quality the way it is. In many cases, it's low, and they leave it. They don't change it. And if you are the type of person to take corrective action, a lot of times there are penalties that accrue to you. Social penalties, work penalties, community penalties, family penalties, from something as subtle as people are not taking any interest in what you're doing, to actual physical fines and other kinds of more aggressive penalties that might accrue to you taking corrective action. Now, I've talked about an example from in another segment of the show, which you can find at shinseimethod.com. When I talked about when I previously lived at an apartment complex, it was a fig tree. And the fig tree, of course, fig trees are great plants, or they're great trees, and they provide something that's very useful and that's very encouraging. Figs, it's nice to eat figs. They taste great. They're good for your health. But they have to be pruned and they have to be clean. You have to clean up after it. In other words, you have to take corrective action. And I talked about in that previous segment the example of I had a fig tree that was near an apartment where I lived. It was actually on the same premises, and no one cleaned it. Even the person I lived with didn't clean it. The landlord didn't clean it. Other tenants didn't clean it. Didn't pick up after it. And it became a real challenge, because fig trees attract rodents, they attract other pests, birds, etc. And so you have to clean it on a regular basis, like you have to clean anything. I did. And what I had, and I talked about in that previous segment, is that I had a lot of people going back by me, looking at me like, what are you doing that for? Like, what's the matter with you? That's what I mean when I say that there's not a lot of social pressure on you when you want to take corrective action. Well, of course, if you take corrective action, you need progress. That was an example of progress, obviously. The progress was that the tree area and the apartment area was cleaned. So that's progress. It's a plus one of that equation, that status quo equation. That plus one was me going out and cleaning up. Well, that's taking corrective action. That is what I mean by progress. But unfortunately, I wanted to use that example again in this segment of the show to highlight that in many social settings, number one, people don't think about this idea of progress. They talk about it a lot, but a lot of people don't take the proper corrective action that would encourage and really necessitate progress. If they're frustrated by something, they don't analyze it and look at it to determine what's a better way to do things. And this applies to work settings too, perhaps even more so. Because in a lot of work settings, you'll see people doing the same thing over and over again, or you see a policy that is promoted by, let's say, the senior level staff or the senior executive management staff. They give you these dictums and dicta from on high that this is how you should do things in the company, even if it's sales oriented, where you are really determined, or your ability to reach bonuses and to sell is much more closely aligned with reality and nature, because obviously it's based upon relationships and principles. And if you're not going to demonstrate to a customer the value of your product and service, it's going to be much less likely. You're going to be much less likely to be able to sell that product. And so you can't get away from that basic fact of reality in sales. In other kinds of positions in the most work settings, you might be able to fudge it a little bit more. You might be able to, quote, fake it a little bit more, which unfortunately a lot of people do. Because you're further removed from this reality. In sales, you're much closer to reality in that if you don't please the customer, you're not going to make the sale. And there's many ways to please a customer. It's not just smiling at them only. it's really providing a value ultimately, because they're going to decide to buy a product and service ultimately versus your competitor. And there's always a competitor. There's always an alternative. If they're going to decide you, a lot of times it comes down to price, of course. That's partly it, but not always. A lot of times it often comes down to service and the quality of service. And what does that mean in practical terms when you're talking about quality of service? It's not just a catch-all phrase. It's not just a platitude. Quality of service means very specific things. It means how you communicate. It means how you treat people with dignity or respect. It means the value that you communicate or you don't in your product and service. Not just convincing a customer by persuading it on your own, but allowing that customer to be persuaded, to allow themselves to be persuaded based upon the information you provide to them, so that they can see for themselves the value of the product and service that you're selling. Now, of course, it helps an awful lot, and of course, you can't really sell a product unless you believe in it. I mean, if it can be done if you want to artificially do it. But in the long run, ultimately, if you're going to continue to buy a product and service, it's because it works and it's a value to the customer, because it often and always comes back to value. Now, when you're talking about progress, of course, in sales or in other aspects of business and life, progress has to do with taking corrective action. So if you, going back to the sales analogy, if you're a salesperson and you don't make a sale, taking corrective action would be to analyze what went wrong or what didn't go right and to take corrective action. That's just one example, one minor but important example of applying corrective action. Now, in many social settings, you don't get the encouragement to do that, even as a salesperson. You want to take corrective action as a salesperson if it's not a part of the manual, or if it's not a part of the company binder or the status quo. A lot of times you won't get any support to make those changes. So the sales, of course, doesn't progress. That's the reality of the situation. Unfortunately, though, if you take this approach where you are taking progress to mean the practice and policy and procedure and philosophy of taking corrective action, you may not get a lot of social support for doing that, even in your work setting. Even if your sales and your bonus and your whole commission structure or your livelihood depends on it. Now, if you're working for yourself, this applies much more easily, because when you're working for yourself, you don't have all those buffers to stand in the way of reality. You have to face reality directly when you work for yourself, because there's really nobody else to rely on. There's no one else to fill in the gap. When you work for yourself, there's really no one else to fill in the gap. And when you are faced with a mistake or some difficulty, if you're in sales, for example, and you work for yourself, you have to face that reality and fill in the shortcomings on your own. And you can't, there's no way to get around that. If you don't do it, you don't make the sales, you don't run the business, your business doesn't progress. So running your own business has a lot of benefits to it. There are some downsides to some degree, because, again, there's nobody to fill in the gaps, and so you are responsible for everything. Now, some people consider that to be a downside. I don't personally, but it can be, I suppose, for some people. So there's a trade-off, pros and cons, of course, to everything that you do. But I use as an example because in many work settings, people have gotten very far removed, and they are allowed to move back or get away from reality. And we see it a lot in many social settings too. I see it very commonly when I see people who don't seem to have any productive work. They don't seem to work for a living. You don't understand, and I never could understand how they can buy the cars. Many of them have new cars. They have irregular lifestyles. They come and they go. There's a lot of distractions. A lot of people don't focus on things. There's not a focus-oriented society. There's not a focus-oriented community in many situations. But of course, if you want to progress, if you want to develop, concentration is crucial. Concentration means focus. But if you don't have a focused society or you don't get a lot of social support to focus, it becomes more difficult to do that when you're on your own, when you're in work settings, because people aren't valuing this very important practice. So therefore, there are a lot of distractions, lots of ringtones, lots of beeps. People are coming and going. They don't schedule out their work time. Now, for example, when I was working for other companies and had positions in major companies, I would often thought that it was very important to map out a work schedule for myself based on what was required, what I typically tended to do, what I needed to get done, etc. Now, schedules should be something that you would think that your managers and other people would at least give you some indication of. They don't necessarily have to provide it to you, but it might be a good blueprint or a template for you if you are taking on a new position and there's certain things that are required to get some kind of a schedule, things that you would be expected to do and when to do it. Most of the time, though, people don't get that. What happens is you get phone calls and all the time. You're expected to answer calls all the time. If you don't answer a call, sometimes you get in trouble. But of course, if you want to really get things done, if you want to progress, a schedule is crucial. So you would want to take calls at a specific time. Well, if you present that to your manager in most work settings, they'll look at you like you're crazy. That's that fig tree example. And I'll go back to that very often. So when I say fig tree example, remember, that has a lot to do with what I talked about in the previous segment of the show. Because I like to go back to that because it's a very, very vivid example of how things often go in reality in many social settings. So if you go to your manager, for example, and say, I'd like to work out a work schedule and take calls at a certain time, probably they'll say no. Just that's the automatic reaction at anything you want to do, even if it can be shown and you can persuade or show that it will improve what you're doing and your progress, your work product. Now, if you have a really good manager, they'll allow it, but that I have found to be very, very uncommon, to be quite frank. So when you are striving toward value, you're striving toward progress in the true sentiment and the true perspective of the Shinsei method, very often in many social settings, you're not going to get a lot of social support. So I developed the Shinsei method to have those fundamental steps of analyzing key terms, define your terms in an individually suitable way. What is progress? Act on those terms, because action is the most potent form of communication, as I indicated in one of my previous books, How to Motivate People in Business and Life and How to Communicate in Business and Life, both of which are on Amazon.com. Action is the most potent form of communication. Nothing gets produced, manufactured, sold, and continued or trained. No one gets trained without action. Action really is what makes the business world go round and what makes the world go round overall. So action is crucial to whatever you do. Action is crucial in progress. So if you want to have some kind of progress and you have to measure that progress, there has to be some action and result. So actions are, of course, going to produce results, and it's really the results that, of course, you are measuring and evaluating. And evaluation is crucial. So again, another principle. Important principle. Evaluation, confirmation, verification, all crucial for this idea of progress. But you'll not hear that and the importance of those principles in many social settings and many business settings and in many business training programs. And again, this is why one of the most important reasons I developed the Shinsei method and why it's so crucial for you. If you're seeking to develop a greater understanding in your life about what is progress, what progress means to you, how you can know when you achieve progress, and how you can continue to maintain a level of progress as you go forward in whatever you're doing in business and life. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.